Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. So the last episode we worked on this thing. It's a 2017 Lamborghini Aventador, and I did a titanium exhaust repair job. And the update from that video to now is the driver's side mounting bracket or upper mounting bracket is now installed, modified, welded together, all of that. So it's good to go, and this car is ready to leave the shop. But we are going to work on something more along the lines of our normal work here and get to building another manifold. So if you guys are familiar with Aaron Gregory from the DSM world, he has, I believe it's the quickest and fastest 1G DSM in the world. And he's a very good friend of mine. And he more or less has been on a yearly manifold subscription from me, as he is constantly changing his setup and constantly trying new and different things. And the time came where it's time for Aaron to have a new manifold as he's changing his setup around. So we are going to start by building the merge collector for Aaron's new manifold. So the materials are right here. And what we have are 3 4-foot long sections, if you can read this, of 1.5" Schedule 10 321 stainless. And we're going to take this pipe and turn it into the collector, which, as I often refer to it, is the heart of a manifold, and this will be the heart of Aaron's new manifold. So he sent me a new fixture, and bear with me as I'm going the wrong way, but I had to shuffle things around a bit to fit all the cars in here, but we just have to make our way through the maze here and be sure to duck. But over here is the new fixture that Aaron sent me. So this minus a 1/2" discrepancy at the head flange, which I'll show you guys how we'll account for that later, is the new fixture for his new manifold. So we'll get into the fixture and everything else later. Right now we need to get started cutting the merge collector, as I'm on limited time today and I really want to get these pieces cut and get this ready to be welded together in the next day or two. So what we are going to do to start is to take 2 of these sections of pipe and cut them in half. And then we'll have 1 full-length section left that will be used for the straight sections on this manifold. Now, the reason that I cut them in half is the way that my collector cutting fixture works. I need to slide the pipe through it, and I guess in this instance, since we're cutting a twin scroll collector, I don't really need to account for any angular rotation, angular movement, or rotation, rather than trying to church up the language a little bit. But I'll still cut them in half and just make things a little bit easier to contend with as we're working through this. And actually, I need to cut 1 of them in half. Math is hard sometimes. So if we cut 1 in half, we'll have 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces for the collector, and then 2 sections of pipe left over. So that way I'm not stitching together sections of straight, and it can look uniform and have the aesthetics that I want. So now that I have my brain on the correct wavelength, let me go ahead and slice this pipe, and we can get to actually cutting the collector. So before we start this cut, let's talk a little bit about saw feed speeds. And when I talk about feed speed, I'm talking about how rapidly or slowly the actual upper beam and the cutting portion of the bandsaw drops down. So to have an actual visual illustration, this is a very fast feed speed right here, and you can actually see the beam going down. Now, how this comes into play with different materials that you're cutting, something that's soft and malleable and easily cut like aluminum, you can get away with a much more aggressive feed speed than you can with something that's harder and more difficult to cut, such as stainless or carbon steel or anything else. Now, the one caveat to that is the way that I cut titanium tubing, especially thin wall tie tubing, as you have to also factor in or consider that the vise is clamping the piece down. And something like this Schedule 10 pipe that has a pretty good wall thickness to it, it isn't going to compress as you squeeze the vise down. However, titanium tubing, like 039 wall tubing like you can get through Tycon, if you try to squeeze that down, it's going to try to oval the tube, and it isn't going to be very happy as you're cutting it. So what I will do, and sometimes at the sacrifice of my bandsaw blade, I'll run a pretty aggressive fast feed speed with titanium tubing while actually holding onto the drop beam or the upper portion of the bandsaw and guiding it down through the material. And this is just to minimize the amount of time that I'm spending actually cutting it and the amount of time that it has to potentially grab, rotate, and destroy the piece of tubing. But all that aside, we'll go ahead and set the feed speed where I like it, which is very slow. Or actually, we'll use a faster feed speed to get the blade nice and close to the surface of the metal. Then come in, set my actual working feed speed, which is right above the upper beam, not actually moving. And kick the saw on, start it feeding, and in a few minutes this cut will be done. Section of pipe is now parted into 2 pieces, and they are right there on the ground. I've also gone ahead and began installing my collector cutting fixture into the bandsaw. So I've shown this fixture before. It's nothing fancy, but it's very effective. And as a refresher, let's go back through it again. So all that it is, and I've had this thing for probably a decade or so at this point in time, and it just still keeps going. But this is a piece of 2-inch schedule pipe with a set bolt on the top side and a couple little nubs on the inside that I put down with some filler rod to center the pipe that's going through it. We have a pivot bolt on the back side, and then on the front side here, we have 3 defined positions that this fixture can sit in, and 3 defined angles that we can cut pieces of collectors with. Beyond that, we're going to stray a bit from the normal angles that I use, and rather than going the whole way out here, making the collector taller, or going the whole way in to make the collector shorter, we're going to kind of split the difference, go right in the middle, and I'll tighten this down kind of like so. We'll tighten the pivot bolt down first so it can't rotate as I'm tightening this one down, and then we'll have our angle set. So the way that this works, or the differences that it makes, if you look at the collector cutting fixture right here in relation to the bandsaw blade, the more the fixture tilts this way, the shorter the collector will be, but the wider the angle of the V, or the splay angle, ends up being. Conversely, the more it moves this way, the narrower that angle is and the taller the collector is, but the more space that it takes up. So it can be a balancing act, and I talked to Aaron a little bit about this, and he said that taller wouldn't be an issue to a certain point, but even with his engine bay being a bit more open, there still are spatial constraints to keep in mind and take into account. So this is what I did the last time for the last manifold I built for him. I'm just going to do the same thing again as it worked then, and it will work now. So let me get this tightened down, get these pieces cut, and I guess the goal for right now is I'll be getting out of here in a few minutes, or a little while rather, is to cut the 4 pieces of the collector, get them parted off of the parent pieces, and then tomorrow we can come in and actually prep and weld the collector together. Skipping over the boring portion of building a collector, all the cutting is now done. So we ended up with this, or these 4 pieces right here. These 6 are for a 2JZ manifold, but these 4 are Aaron's collector pieces. So I talked a little bit about the splay angle before, and see if I can do this with one hand. That's essentially what we ended up with. So you can see that angle right there, and I can use a couple of these 2JZ pieces as they are the taller angle that I typically use. And you guys may or may not be able to see the difference. There is the normal taller or less angle involved with display angle that we're using for the collector. So how this works in practice, the taller the collector is, the longer the collector is, the less aggressive that the angle is, meaning the tighter the V is, the less collision of exhaust gas there will be inside of the collector, and the more energy and force is actually making its way into the turbine housing and doing work on the turbine wheel. Conversely, the wider the V angle is, the shorter it is, you can fit it in a tighter location. However, the more collision there is of exhaust gas, the more turbulence, and the greater wasted energy there is in the collector, as opposed to going through the collector into the turbine housing. You have turbulence inside of the collector, and you can run into some issues that way. But that being said, this collector is ready to go, and probably tomorrow can come in, prep it, get it welded, and start fitting it to the flange. But I'm going to get out of here for now. I'll see you guys then, and we'll keep going with Aaron's new manifold. And we're back. Today we are going to knock out Aaron's new merge collector for his new exhaust manifold. So the Lamborghini is gone now. The Super is back in its rightful home. And if I snake through here to grab the pieces, these 4 pieces right here are Aaron's new merge collector. So we need to prep these, weld these, put them on the flange or fit them to the flange, do the wastegate provisioning, etc., etc. So that's ideally what we get knocked out today. So now that I have my space back, I can go ahead, get these sanders all set up, and get to deburring and beveling and everything else. And before long, we'll be welding. So before I drone on, let's go ahead and get to it. The 2 halves of Aaron's new 4-cylinder twin scroll collector are completed, or at least welded up, I should say. So here's what we ended up with. There's one half there, the other half there, and I'm quite happy with the way the welds came out on these 2 collector halves. So it's time now for lunch for the daily Chipotle burrito. And once I get back from that, we can go ahead and figure out the cutoff point of these 2 collector halves, get them cut, get them fit to the turbine flange, and start doing the wastegate provisioning. All right, let's go ahead and get these collector halves at least cut and fit to this turbine flange. So here we have a stainless T4 twin scroll turbine flange, and we have our collector halves. So what we need to do is figure out where to cut these so they fit down onto the flange appropriately. Now, obviously, I made the collectors much longer than they need to be, and that's to give me as much material as I can have, or as much material as I need to fit these collector halves appropriately to the flange. So if you are doing a production manifold, you would obviously cut less or have less material for each of the collector pieces. But being that this is a custom one-off deal for Aaron, you can, or I always factor in a little bit more just so that way I don't have to do the same work multiple times. So this hopefully won't be too bad. I'll just hold it up centered and kind of eyeball from the side of the collector somewhere in here down to the turbine flange and get a rough idea of where it needs to be cut. And then from there I can make that cut and trim a little bit more if need be, so on and so forth, make it fit appropriately, then repeat the process for the other half. Just like that, we have this collector half just placed on the turbine flange for the time being. And where I ended up cutting it, which was more or less 3.5 inches from the bottom to the top on this side, and 3 3/4 of an inch from the bottom to the top on this side. So why those sides are different, when you're building a twin scroll collector, you need to account for a bit of a splay angle between the collector halves, just so you can get in, weld between them, and then as you're building the primaries, so you can actually make them all fit and able to be welded the whole way around. So typically what I've found is on the inside of a twin scroll collector, the overall length of it ends up being, at least for mine, 1/4 inch longer than the outside, and that gives me that nice little kick out that way. That works oh so nicely when you're actually going to weld it. So the inside ended up pretty nicely. You can see there's just a little bit of overlap on the inside, right kind of on the inside of the pipe where my finger is there. And that's no big deal. When I go in, or when I go to actually weld this collector to the turbine flange, I'll go on the inside, deposit material there, and blend it in to create a nice smooth transition that way. So now that I know that these measurements work, I can go ahead, repeat the same process for the other collector half, and at that point in time, we will be ready to tack these to the turbine flange and start figuring out where our wastegate provisioning is going to be located. With all of the collector pieces, or collector halves, now tack welded onto the turbine flange, we can see kind of how this manifold is shaped, or going to be shaped, and kind of how it sits. So we're sitting a little bit off, a little bit rotated from level, but that's no big deal, as this is really the only vantage point that we need. And actually, I'm going to tip this down so we have a little bit straighter shot on the collector. So we need to work on the wastegate provisioning now. And Aaron has pretty much 2 criteria that I need to abide by in the construction of this provisioning. So he said it needs to be as tight to the collector as it can, and we need a little bit of a backwards angle. Backwards meaning the wastegate's pointing a little bit towards the head flange here to get everything to fit properly. So I'm going to get a couple of 90-degree bends. I'll get them cut or get them teardrop cut and coped and ready to go on the side of the collector. And we'll see kind of roughly how things need to fit together, or how they're going to, and then check with Aaron to make sure it works for him. I have hopefully all the pieces cut for Aaron's wastegate provisioning, and I had to get a little bit unconventional with the way that I did this. So we have our actual coped inlets, and if you look here, it may be a little bit difficult to tell, but these actually account for a 15-degree angle, as when I measured from the actual turbine flange to the one of the pipes on the collector, there's a 15-degree discrepancy here. And why I factored that in is 15 degrees puts this piece parallel to the side of the flange, perpendicular to the top of it. Gives me a straight outlet for the wastegate provision. And beyond that, I went ahead and I had a short radius 90 that I cut into 2 short radius 45s. As, like I said earlier, Aaron wants this packaged as tightly as I can, and using short radius bends is the way to do that. The last bit that is a little bit unconventional is the actual outlets of the wastegate inlets, if that makes sense. I cut these down quite a bit, as these are both long radius bends as opposed to short radius, and I'm just trying to keep this as tight together as I possibly can, so that way I take up as little space as possible and keep Aaron, keep him happy. So I'm going to show him what I have so far, see if I get approval to proceed. If not, then we'll have to go back to the drawing board with how I'm doing this, but that wouldn't be the end of the world. Just take a couple other pieces, cut them, and make it work. But let me check with him, and then I'll check back in with you guys. A little bit of modification later, and we have Aaron's wastegate provisioning squared away. So what I needed to do is, this is the rear. I rotated the rear from its initial location that was, I don't know, somewhere around there. Went back a little bit more with it. Front wastegate provision, same thing, something like that to something like that. And this just gives Aaron a little bit more room to work with his hot side intercooler tube. So now that we have the locations squared away, the last thing I'm going to do today is weld the wastegate provisions together. Now, this will just lock the coped portion, the teardrop portion, and the tight radius 45s in place, and will be one less weld that I have to do tomorrow when I work on the rest of this. So let me get the machine fired back up, get a back purge started, we'll get these knocked out, and then tomorrow we can come in and actually punch the holes out in the 2 collector halves and get well on our way with this thing. Both of the wastegate provisions are welded, minus the flanges, as I'm still waiting for those to arrive. But these are welded now, and that's the last thing I'm going to do today. So tomorrow I will come in and take these collector halves off of the turbine flange, cut the holes in them, and then we are playing the waiting game until the other wastegate flanges arrive. So I guess I will see you guys then. We'll make a bit more of a mess cutting some holes, and before too long we'll have a completed collector and a completed manifold to send down to Aaron. We are back to continue working on Aaron's new exhaust manifold. So right here I have his new head flange. It's a really nice piece with a 3D, they call this a 3D head flange, but it has a protruding gasket surface on the actual mating side and transitions from the actual port shape to round on the face of it, as well as receivers to allow the pipe to sit properly, or sit properly on the flange. So I need to prep the surface finish on that, but we are going to work on this in a little bit different order than what I typically do, because I'm still waiting on the wastegate flanges that will be here in a day or two, I believe. And I don't want to sit idly until that time comes. So we could still be making progress on this, and that's exactly what I plan to do. So at this point, I would typically come in and do all the wastegate provisioning and all of that, but we're going to change it up a bit and actually build the primaries, get all of that done, so that way I can get them welded, get the bulk of the manifold done, and then when the wastegate flanges arrive, I can finish the provisions break the collector apart, cut the holes, weld everything together, so on and so forth at that point in time. So we have our collector at this point. Let's go ahead, put it back on our fixture here. I can get that head flange prepped, get it brought over, and I'll show you what we're doing to compensate for shortening the manifold in its overall length a 1/2 inch. With the collector back on the fixture, we can now go ahead and fasten everything together and get ready to start building primaries. So, like I said, we need to compensate for more or less a 1/2 inch moving the actual head flange for the manifold out, and therefore shifting the entire manifold back, if that makes sense. And the way that we are going to do that is to take another head flange, sandwich it in between the actual fixture plate on the head flange, and then take the head flange that we're working with, fasten it down, and everything will work that way. So what we have are two, I believe they are 7/16 bolts. These will serve essentially as locating pins or locating dowels. And we'll slide these through. And at that point in time, we can go ahead and put our spacer head flange on, and then put the actual head flange on top of that. So it's a weird sandwich ordeal, and we'll use these two fasteners to actually hold everything together. But I think it should work out fine, and everything will be well at the end of it. So let me go ahead and get this assembled, and then we can get to building primaries. Everything is put in place right where it needs to be. Like I said, I just used some normal fixture fasteners to actually hold all this together, and then these 7/16 bolts are really just there as dowels to make sure that everything's aligned where it needs to be. So, as far as where the primaries are going to run, I think what I'm going to do is run the two outside primaries to the rear half of the collector, and the two inside primaries to the front. Now, similar to the SRT4, or the tube header on the SRT4 behind me, I'm not really going for equal length. I don't really care that much about making an equal length turbo manifold, but we're going to do what we can where we can to try to get them in the ballpark of at least similar lengths. So if you look at this, if I were to run the two centers to the rear, two outsides to the front, that ends up putting additional length on the two outside primaries and shorter lengths on the two insides. If I run the two outsides to the back, the two insides to the front, then we're equalizing the lengths a little bit, and I don't think there's going to be a massive performance benefit or detriment from this, but that's just the way that my mind is working right now, so that's what we're going to do. The other benefit as well is with this area needing to be utilized by the wastegates, if I run everything in the orientation that I'm talking about now, that really frees up all this space, as none of the pipes should be coming anywhere near this area, and there'll be plenty of real estate for wastegates and dump tubes and things along those lines. So without me droning on anymore, let's go ahead and start stringing some pipes. After another day of fab, here's what we're left with on Aaron's new manifold. So, pretty happy with how it came out. And nothing really looks all that goofy, which I'm very happy about. Like I said in the fabrication video for the SRT4, when you're building custom manifolds, at least a 4-cylinder one we use for instance, for example, since the math is easy, 3/4 of the primaries will come out nice, and you'll typically have 1/4 or 25% or one of the primaries that ends up looking a bit goofy. But this manifold, I'm pretty happy with how everything fell into place with it. And everything, while not equal length, I added length to the primaries that would have been shorter if I altered the path of them, and I'm very happy with the way that this all came together. So I will check with Aaron, make sure that he likes the form that we have. If I get the go-ahead from him, then tomorrow is welding day. But welding day will be the next video for you guys, as I think this video should probably have enough content between doing the collector and fabricating all the primaries. So we'll catch up in the next episode when we actually put some color on these pipes and get the rest of the manifold wrapped up. So thank you guys, as always, for tuning in, for watching all these wild custom header and manifold projects lately that I've had come through the shop. So hopefully it's been entertaining for you guys. Hopefully you've learned something, as I know that I have. I learned something every time that I build one of these parts. But without me rambling on any farther, that'll be the end of this video. So until next time, be sure to subscribe, leave a like, leave a comment, and I will see you guys in the next episode.